The wind howled across the vast emptiness, carrying with it the echoes of an untamed world. It did not whisper, it roared. It screamed of wars yet to come, of thrones yet to fall, of a name that would one day thunder across the earth like an unrelenting tempest. Temujin. He was not born into destiny. He was not gifted power. He was forged in suffering, shaped by betrayal, tempered by the unyielding grasp of death itself. He was a boy before he was a warrior, a ghost before he became a legend. He should have been nothing, another forgotten soul swallowed by the steppe. But he did not kneel. He did not break. He learned, in the bitter cold of exile, that mercy was a lie, that the strong ruled and the weak were swept away like dust on the wind. He was hunted, starved, beaten, shackled, but with every wound he grew sharper. Every betrayal carved away the softness of youth, leaving only steel beneath. And when the time came, he rose. He did not beg for loyalty, he commanded it. He did not plead for unity, he forged it in fire and blood. His warriors were not men of privilege, but outcasts and survivors, wolves who had tasted the edge of death and emerged with hunger in their eyes. He did not conquer for wealth or for vanity, but because the world itself bent before him, because fate, trembling, had no choice but to yield. They called him Genghis Khan. His name became a storm that swept across continents, breaking the unbreakable, crushing the mighty, humbling the eternal. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years were turned to ash in his wake. Kings who once ruled with arrogance wept before him. The old world crumbled, and from its ruins he shaped a new order. From the frozen wastes of Siberia to the scorching deserts of Persia, from the towering peaks of China to the trembling walls of Europe, his empire stretched further than any had before. Some called him a monster, a force of destruction. Others called him a lawgiver, a god of war, a hand of destiny itself. But no one could ignore him. Even now, centuries after the last hoofbeats of his riders faded into legend, his shadow remains. In the laws that govern nations, in the bloodlines that span continents, in the whisper of the wind that still carries his name. This is not merely the tale of a conqueror. This is the birth of a storm. This is the legend of Genghis Khan. The wind howled across the Mongolian steppe, a vast and unforgiving sea of grass where the sky stretched endlessly, untouched by walls or borders. It was a land where survival was not a privilege, but a test, where only the ruthless, the strong, and the cunning could carve their names into the bones of history. It was here, in the year 1162, or perhaps a little earlier, for time itself was uncertain in this wild expanse, that a child was born, his tiny fingers curled as if already grasping for destiny. His name was Temujin, son of Yesugei, a respected but embattled chieftain of the Borjigin clan. Yet, for all the prestige that name should have carried, fate had no intention of offering the boy an easy path. He was born beneath the shadow of violence, his first breath mingling with the scent of blood. Some say he came into the world clutching a blood clot in his fist, a sign, the elders whispered, that this child was destined to be a harbinger of war, a breaker of chains. But prophecy is a cruel and fickle thing, and no divine hand guided Temujin's childhood. Instead, his early years were a brutal lesson in suffering. His father, poisoned by treachery at the hands of rival Tatars, fell before the boy could truly know his strength. With Yesugei dead, the family's fate was sealed. His mother, Holun, once a stolen bride, now a grieving widow, was cast out alongside her children, abandoned by the very people who had once called them kin. Hunger was their first enemy, a relentless force gnawing at their bellies as they scavenged for scraps, fishing in frozen rivers, pulling up weeds and roots when the cruel Mongolian winters refused to relent. Temujin learned young that weakness was not tolerated on the steppe. He saw it in the hollowed cheeks of his younger brothers, in his mother's tired eyes as she fought against despair. And yet, there was steel in the boy's soul. Even as his body withered from starvation, his mind sharpened like a blade. The steppe did not raise men with soft hands. It forged them in hardship, tempered them in suffering. Temujin understood early that survival was a game of power, of alliances, of knowing when to strike and when to endure. But endurance was not enough. To survive was one thing, to rule was another. The lesson came brutally when his own blood betrayed him. His older half-brother Bekta sought to claim dominion over the family, to bend Temujin and his siblings to his will. But Temujin was no servant, and he was no child to be cowed by fear. With a crude bow and arrow, he and his younger brother Kasar ended Bekta's claim with a single shaft to the heart. Murder, not in rage, not in passion, but in cold necessity. There was no room for sentiment in the laws of the steppe, only power, only survival. But power was still beyond his reach. At the age of 16, he was taken as a slave, shackled and humiliated by a rival clan. The bonds that held him were iron, but in his mind, they may as well have been reeds. He studied his captors, watched them, learned their weaknesses, and then, one night, with the icy wind howling its hymn of freedom, he escaped, vanishing into the darkness, a ghost slipping from the grasp of fate. That night he was no longer just a boy. That night he became something else, a wolf among men, a shadow on the steppe. With his freedom reclaimed, he sought strength in unity. He returned to the woman who had been promised to him, Berta, his love, his partner, his first and truest ally. But happiness was fleeting, stolen from him as she was taken by raiders from the Merkit tribe, an act of vengeance for the sins of his father. Temujin did not grieve. He did not falter. He gathered what allies he could, old friends, blood-bonded brothers, warriors who saw in him not just a man, but a force of nature. Together, they rode against the Merkits like a storm, breaking against the mountains. Steel clashed, arrows darkened the sky, and by the time the dust had settled, Berta was back in his arms, rescued, though forever changed by her captivity. The world was teaching Temujin its cruelest lesson. Nothing was given, only taken. He had taken back his wife. He had taken back his freedom. Now he would take back the future itself. The Mongol tribes were fractured, torn by feuds and rivalries that stretched back generations. But Temujin saw what others did not. He saw what could be. He would not bow to the old ways of petty kings and shifting loyalties. He would reshape the Mongol world, bend it to his will, make it a single force that no nation could withstand. And so, in the twilight of his youth, the boy who had once been starving and abandoned became a leader of men. He gathered warriors to his cause, not through bloodline, but through merit, through loyalty earned on the battlefield. His army was not built on tradition, but on trust, on the bonds of hardship and victory. He was no longer just Temujin. He was something greater, something more. A storm rising over the steppe, a force that would sweep across the world. His enemies did not know it yet. But the age of Genghis Khan had begun. The steppe was a graveyard of forgotten kings. For centuries, warlords had risen and fallen like blades of grass beneath the hooves of war horses, their names swallowed by the wind. No man had ever bound the scattered Mongol tribes into one. No man had ever tamed the chaos of the steppes. No man until Temujin. He was no longer a boy, no longer the starving outcast who had scavenged for roots and fish. He was a warrior now, hardened by suffering, sharpened by betrayal. But strength alone was not enough to claim the soul of a people. The Mongols were a wild and fractured race, bound by blood feuds and ancient grudges, ruled by lords who clung to their power like wolves over scraps of meat. To unify them, Temujin would have to do what no other had done. He would have to break them and then forge them anew. The first warlord to taste his wrath was Togrul, the Khan of the Karait, once a friend to his father. At first, Togrul embraced him, calling him son, promising him an alliance. But alliances were fragile things, shattered by greed and fear. When Temujin's power grew, Togrul turned, plotting his death. It was an old Mongol tale. Friendship turned to treachery, loyalty betrayed. But Temujin was not a man to fall quietly into the dust. He struck first, swift as a winter storm. His men, bound not by blood, but by unshakable trust, rode against Togrul's armies and shattered them. The old Khan fled, only to be slain in the wilderness, his bones left to be picked clean by scavengers. One enemy had fallen, but there was another, Jamuka. Jamuka, the blood brother of his youth, the boy who had once ridden beside him as an equal. Together, they had dreamed of ruling the steppes. Together, they had sworn oaths beneath the open sky. But oaths meant nothing to fate. They had chosen different paths. Temujin, the path of discipline and order. Jamuka, the path of noble birth and tradition. And so, when the time came, they met as enemies. Their war was not a single battle, but a storm that raged for years, a clash of fire and steel across the endless plains. At first, Jamuka struck the cruelest blow, defeating Temujin in battle, capturing his warriors, and executing them in the most brutal fashion. Not with simple death, but with torment. He boiled 70 of them alive, their screams rising to the heavens like a sacrifice to the gods of war. But Temujin did not break. His vengeance was patient, measured, relentless. He built his army not from the nobility of birth, but from the lowest of men, from outcasts and wanderers, from warriors who had nothing but their will to fight. He redefined the Mongol way of war, not as scattered raids and shifting allegiances, but as a single, disciplined force. He rewarded loyalty. He punished betrayal. He turned the Mongol army into a weapon unlike any the world had seen. And when the time was right, he struck. In 1206, beneath the eternal blue sky, Jamuka knelt before him, defeated. The old ways had crumbled, and only one ruler remained. But even in victory, Temujin did not forget the love of his youth. He did not boil Jamuka alive. He did not drag him through the dirt like a conquered slave. Instead, he gave him mercy, the mercy of a swift and honorable death. With Jamuka's passing, there were no more rivals, no more warlords to challenge him. The Mongol tribes, once scattered, once drowning in their own feuds, were now one. They stood before him, warriors of the steppes, and they gave him a new name, a name that would be whispered in terror and awe from the deserts of Persia to the walls of China. Genghis Khan, universal ruler. And the world had no idea what was coming. The first thing the world learned about Genghis Khan was that he did not conquer like other men. Kings waged wars of vanity, of pride, of borders drawn on fragile maps. But Genghis Khan? He was not a king. He was a storm, a force of nature, a living god of war. He did not merely defeat his enemies, he erased them. His conquests began with the Xixia, the kingdom that dared to defy him. Nestled between the Mongolian steppe and the rich lands of China, the Xixia had long viewed the Mongols as little more than raiders, a nuisance to be bought off with gifts of silk and gold. But Genghis Khan was not a raider, and he could not be bought. In 1209, he rode against them, his armies moving like thunder over the desert. The Xixia hid behind their walls, believing their fortresses would protect them. They did not yet understand the mind of Genghis Khan. He did not simply attack, he adapted. He studied siege warfare, turned his riders into engineers, used rivers to flood cities, built ramps of earth to climb walls. The Xixia surrendered, their rulers bowing before him, swearing eternal loyalty. Loyalty, a word that meant nothing when spoken in fear. For when the Xixia dared to resist him again, years later, Genghis Khan did not waste time with mercy. He burned their cities to the ground, slaughtered their people, and wiped their name from history. Their culture, their language, their very existence vanished. The world was watching, and the world was afraid. But fear did not stop the Jin dynasty, the great empire of northern China, from underestimating him. They had millions. He had thousands. They had wealth, walls, armies, clad in iron. He had warriors who had known hunger, men who had been born in the cold and lived through hardship. And in war, suffering breeds strength. For 20 years, he waged his campaign against the Jin, a relentless, grinding war that broke one of the most powerful dynasties on earth. His horsemen moved like ghosts, appearing and vanishing with the wind, striking from the shadows, retreating only to return stronger. City after city fell, their gates shattered, their people given the choice, surrender and live, resist and perish. But it was not until Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing, that the world truly understood what it meant to defy Genghis Khan. The city held for months, its defenders believing they could outlast him, that he would tire, that the nomadic hordes would wither beneath the weight of stone walls. They were wrong. When Zhongdu finally fell, the streets ran red with blood. It is said that the rivers were choked with bodies, that the Mongols piled skulls into pyramids as a warning to those who might resist. He did not wage war to conquer. He waged war to end resistance, to ensure that when the next city heard his name, they would open their gates before the first arrow flew. And yet, his greatest wrath was still to come. In 1218, an empire far to the west made a fatal mistake. The Khwarezmian Empire, a vast Persian dynasty ruled by Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad, had a choice. Genghis Khan did not seek war. He sent emissaries, offering trade, offering peace. But the Shah, blinded by arrogance, killed the envoys, mutilating their bodies and sending their remains back to the Mongols as an insult. To kill a messenger was to declare war, but the Shah had not declared war on a mere man. He had declared war on death itself. In 1219, Genghis Khan unleashed his fury. The Mongols moved like a plague across the land, faster than any army had a right to move, covering vast distances in days, striking with the force of an earthquake. The Khwarezmians had cities with walls that had stood for centuries, fortresses that no enemy had ever breached. But walls meant nothing to him. Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgench, one by one, the great cities of Persia fell, and with them, fell the people. Genghis Khan did not merely win, he punished. He massacred entire populations, razed entire civilizations, turning fertile lands into wastelands of ash. He found the Shah, once a ruler of millions, now a pathetic fugitive, dying on an island in the Caspian Sea, his empire obliterated, his people scattered like dust on the wind. The Mongols had become unstoppable. But war was never just about destruction. Genghis Khan was not a mindless butcher. He understood the power of fear, but he also understood the power of order. In every city he conquered, he spared the artisans, the scholars, the engineers. He took the greatest minds of Persia, China, and the Islamic world and made them his own. His empire was not built solely on conquest. It was built on knowledge, on roads that connected lands that had never before been linked, on trade routes that brought silk, spices, and ideas from one corner of the earth to another. And yet, for all his victories, war would never leave him. It was the only home he had ever known. The armies of Genghis Khan moved like the hand of fate itself, stretching across Asia, reaching toward the edges of the world. He was no longer just a man. He was a legend, a whisper in the dark, a name that sent kings trembling to their knees. And the blood he spilled was only the beginning dot. The Mongolian steppe stretched out like an ocean of earth, endless and eternal beneath the heavens. The sky had always belonged to the Mongols, unbroken, unchained, the great blue sky under which they rode. Now the world belonged to them as well, as, from the scorching sands of Persia to the frozen rivers of Siberia, from the walls of China to the forests of Europe, the empire of Genghis Khan had no rival, no equal. His banners flew over cities that had once stood defiant. His laws governed lands that had never before known a common ruler. He was not merely a conqueror, he was a builder, a lawmaker, a force that reshaped civilization itself. The old world had been divided, fractured by petty rulers, torn apart by greed, by feudal lords who hoarded power like dragons over their gold. Genghis Khan did not tolerate division. Where other rulers built kingdoms of bloodlines and noble birth, he built an empire of merit, loyalty, and law. His Yasa, the great code of the Mongols, bound his people together with unbreakable discipline. It was a law that knew no exceptions, no privileges. Before it, all men were equal, from the lowest horseman to the Khan himself. Theft was punished with death. Treachery was answered with annihilation. The weak, the vulnerable, women, children, the elderly were protected under its rule. And for the first time in history, the empire did not care what gods a man prayed to, what name he called sacred. Religious tolerance was not a suggestion, it was law. He understood what the empires before him had failed to grasp, that a kingdom ruled by fear alone would crumble, but a kingdom ruled by order, opportunity, and justice would endure. And so he built roads, great arteries that bound the empire together. His messengers, the Yam system, moved faster than any army, carrying news, commands, and trade across thousands of miles in mere days. No emperor before him had dared to dream of such a thing, a world connected not by borders, but by movement, by commerce, by a single rule of law. The Silk Road, once a dangerous path through deserts and mountains, now thrived under Mongol protection. Where once bandits had lurked, Mongol patrols now rode. Where once merchants feared for their lives, they now carried goods from China to Persia, from Russia to India. Gold, silk, spices, art, and knowledge flowed through his empire as freely as the wind over the steppe. And with knowledge came something greater than war, progress. The Mongols, once thought of as simple horsemen, now commanded the greatest minds of their time. Persian astronomers, Chinese engineers, Arab mathematicians, all were brought into the fold, their wisdom woven into the fabric of Mongol rule. The secrets of irrigation, architecture, medicine, and governance were no longer confined to single nations. They spread, absorbed, and redistributed across a world that had never before been so vast, yet so connected. But Genghis Khan himself was not a man of palaces. He did not rule from golden thrones, did not drown himself in luxury like the emperors he had crushed. His palace was the saddle, his throne the back of a horse. While his empire grew richer than any before it, he still ate the same food, drank the same fermented mare's milk, slept beneath the same stars as his men. And yet, for all his laws, for all his visions of a united empire, there was always one law greater than his own, the law of the steppe, the law of war. He could never stop moving. The Mongols could never rest. Expansion was not merely desire, it was necessity. If the empire ceased to grow, if his warriors became idle, if the conquest slowed, then the unity he had fought so hard to forge would begin to crack. So he rode. He rode ever onward, into new lands, new battles, for an empire as vast as the sky itself could never be still. But the sky does not belong to any one man forever, and even Genghis Khan could not outrun death. The steppe had always carried him forward, its rolling hills and endless horizons stretching beyond the reach of time itself. But even the greatest riders must one day dismount. Even the mightiest storms must fade. He had ridden further than any man before him, shaped the world with the fire of his will, shattered empires that had once believed themselves eternal. The rivers of China had whispered his name. The deserts of Persia had trembled beneath his hooves. The forests of Europe had watched in silence as his riders drew near, their swords wet with the blood of kings. But no man outruns the march of years. Some say it was in the highlands of Western Shia where he was thrown from his horse, his bones breaking under the weight of his own legend. Others whisper of an assassin's arrow, piercing his flesh, but failing to take his life, leaving only a wound that festered, that wore him down day by day. There are even those who claim that a woman, a captive princess taken from a conquered land, swore vengeance as she lay in his bed and found a way to end him in silence. But none of these stories are certain. What is certain is this: Genghis Khan, the man who had made the world tremble, had reached the edge of life's horizon. He had seen the signs. He had felt the slow betrayal of his own body, the strength that once made him a god among men, now slipping little by little beyond his reach. But if he feared it, he did not show it. Fear was for lesser men. Fear was for those who had wasted their lives, who had not burned as brightly, who had not carved their names so deeply into history that time itself would struggle to erase them. As he lay dying, the war still raged beyond his tent. His armies had not yet finished crushing the Chishia, the last of the enemies who had dared defy him. His sons and generals stood outside, waiting for his word, for his final command. Even now, at the threshold of death, he was not a man who pleaded for more time. He did not rage against the fading light. He had spent every breath of his life conquering, building, ruling. There was nothing left to beg for. And yet, he still had one last order to give. His burial was to be a secret. No monument, no shrine. No place where his enemies could desecrate his bones, no site where his followers could gather in worship. The earth itself would guard him, keeping his resting place hidden forever. It is said that when he died, His most loyal warriors took his body and rode to the most remote corners of the Mongolian steppe. They buried him in an unmarked grave, covering the earth with stones and grass, making the land forget it had ever been disturbed. 1,000 horses trampled the ground above him to erase all trace of the burial. Trees were planted, rivers diverted, and the men who dug his grave were killed, their own bodies left to rot, so that no soul could ever whisper the location. And so Genghis Khan became part of the land itself. But even as his body vanished into the earth, his empire did not crumble. For more than a century, the Mongols ruled the largest land empire in human history, an empire larger than Rome, larger than Alexander's, larger than anything the world had ever seen. But conquest alone was not his true legacy, it was what came after. Because of him, the East and the West were no longer strangers. For the first time, ideas flowed freely from China to Persia, from Russia to the farthest corners of Europe. The Silk Road, once a dangerous and fragmented trade route, now thrived under Mongol protection. Merchants carried not just goods but knowledge, maps, medicines, mathematics, philosophies that had once been locked within their own lands, now spreading like wildfire. Where once kings had ruled by birthright alone, Genghis Khan had built an empire on merit. His warriors rose through the ranks not by noble blood, but by their skill in battle. His administrators were not only Mongols, but men of every land he had conquered, Persians, Chinese, Turks, all bound together under the rule of a single law. And that law, the Yasa, was unlike anything the world had known. Under it, no man, no matter how great, was above justice. Theft was punished with death. Treachery was answered with annihilation. But religion? Religion was free. In a time when men killed each other over gods and prophets, Genghis Khan did not force a single faith upon his empire. The Buddhist, the Christian, the Muslim, the shaman, all were equal before him. To him, it was not the gods that made men worthy. It was their loyalty, their strength, their ability to serve a greater purpose. And in this, his true empire was built, not just of land and conquest, but of unity, of knowledge, of a world that, for the first time, understood itself as one. But time does not bow to kings, not even to those who shake the earth. The empire would not last forever. Power would slip between the fingers of his descendants, just as it had for every dynasty before them. The Mongol rulers would fracture, their ambition turning inward, their unity dissolving. The lands he had conquered would rise again, reclaiming their own names, their own rulers, their own destinies. And yet, something remained, something no empire, no king, no time could erase. His name. It has been 8 centuries since Genghis Khan last rode beneath the open sky, and still his shadow stretches across the world. His blood runs in the veins of millions, his legacy woven into the very fabric of history. There is no ruler who does not know his name, no historian who can deny his impact, no land untouched by what he built, what he destroyed, what he changed forever. Even now, beneath the eternal blue sky, where the wind moves across the empty steppe, where the horses still run wild and free, his spirit rides on. For the earth may forget where he rests, but history will never forget the thunder of his hooves. Centuries have passed, empires have risen and fallen, their names swallowed by time, their banners turned to dust. The world has changed in ways even the great Khan could never have foreseen. Iron replaced by gunpowder, horses replaced by machines, the vast distances he once crossed in weeks, now bridged in mere hours. And yet, though the winds of time have swept away the kingdoms of old, his name remains. Genghis Khan was not just a conqueror. He was a force of nature. His rise was not a mere moment in history. It was a shift so profound that the ripples still touch the shores of the present. His legacy is not confined to the ruins of his empire. It lingers in the bones of nations, in the blood of millions, in the very way the modern world has come to understand itself. Borders, trade, diplomacy, war, each of these things in some way still carries his mark. A world once divided, now connected. Before him, civilizations were isolated, walled within their own knowledge, their own customs, their own fears. The East and the West were not yet threads in the same fabric, but distant echoes of one another, separated by suspicion, by distance, by the unknown. Genghis Khan tore down those barriers. His empire, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the Danube, became the first true global network, an empire where information, commerce, and culture flowed freely. Under his rule, a Persian astronomer could work in China, an Arab trader could travel to Mongolia without fear, a European diplomat could stand before the court of the Khan himself. The once impenetrable Silk Road, the artery of the ancient world, flourished beneath Mongol protection, a lifeline that carried not only silk and spices, but knowledge, medicine, mathematics, philosophy, art. The very foundations of the modern global economy, the exchange of goods, the fusion of cultures, the concept of open and protected trade routes, were laid by his hand. Even now, as the 21st century unfolds, the echoes of his empire remain. The roads he secured became the ancestors of modern trade networks. The postal system he established a forerunner to modern communication. The Mongol spirit of mobility, of adaptability, of conquest not just of land but of possibility, still shapes the world we live in today. A legacy etched in blood and law. His empire was built upon war, upon fire, upon the unyielding march of conquest. And yet, for all the devastation he wrought, his rule was not one of mindless destruction. He was not merely a warrior, he was a lawgiver. Where he conquered, he did not simply leave ruins in his wake, he left order. His yasa, the code of the Mongols, was one of the first great legal systems to treat all men, Mongol or foreigner, noble or commoner, with the same iron hand of justice. It was brutal, yes, but it was also revolutionary. No man was above the law, not even the Khan himself. This principle, so radical in his time, now forms the bedrock of modern legal systems. The very idea that a nation must be ruled not by the whims of men, but by a code that applies to all, owes part of its history to the unyielding discipline of the Mongols. And though the Mongol Empire itself would fade, the lands it touched would never be the same. China, Persia, Russia, India, Europe, each carried something of him forward, absorbed his influence, built upon his foundation. Russia, once a fragmented land of warring principalities, would be united under the shadow of Mongol rule, its centralized power structure a mirror of the Khan's authority. China, once dismissive of the steppe warriors, would see Mongol governance shape the Yuan dynasty, forever altering its history. Even in the West, whispers of his empire would influence military tactics, governance, diplomacy. The blood of an empire that never truly died. And then there is the most literal legacy of all, the legacy written in flesh and bone. It is said that as many as 16 million men alive today carry his blood. A lineage so vast, so widespread, that it remains one of the greatest genetic footprints left by any single man in history. A conqueror who did not just shape nations, he seeded them. But Genghis Khan's true legacy is not measured in borders, nor in bloodlines, nor even in the laws that still echo his rule. His true legacy is the lesson of his rise. He began with nothing, a boy cast into the wilderness, betrayed, hunted, abandoned. The world gave him nothing, so he took everything. He forged himself in hardship, in loss, in pain. He did not accept the fate the world had chosen for him. Instead, he rewrote history with his own hands, shaped it with his will, carved his name so deeply into the bones of the earth that even time itself has failed to wash it away. And this is the lesson that still endures. That greatness is not given, but seized. That history does not remember the comfortable, the complacent. It remembers those who dared to ride against the wind, to shatter the order of the world, to shape their own destiny with fire and steel. Even now, beneath the eternal blue sky, where the wind sweeps across the silent steppe, his name lingers in the air. For men may die, empires may crumble, but legends ride forever.